The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked asphalt of Rodriguez's Corner Market, a small gas station that sat at the intersection of two dusty roads in the forgotten town of Cedar Ridge, Texas. Carlos Rodriguez, 58, methodically arranged fresh tamales in his mobile food cart, the same routine he'd followed every day for the past 5 years since retiring from a career that officially never existed. To passing motorists, he appeared to be just another hardworking immigrant trying to make an honest living, selling homemade Mexican food to truckers and travelers who stopped for gas and a quick meal. What those motorists couldn't know was that Carlos Rodriguez had spent 23 years as one of the most lethal snipers in U.S. Special Operations, with a confirmed kill count that remained classified at the highest levels of government. His weathered hands, now gently arranging corn husks and checking the temperature of his portable steamer, had once held a Barrett M82.5 caliber rifle steady enough to eliminate targets at distances exceeding a mile. The same patient precision that made him deadly on battlefields across 3 continents now ensured that every tamale was perfectly seasoned and every customer received exactly what they ordered. But that peaceful chapter of his life was about to be violently interrupted by 4 men who had no idea they were about to make the worst mistake of their criminal careers. Carlos wiped the sweat from his forehead with a clean towel, glancing at the digital thermometer clipped to his cart. The October heat in East Texas was brutal, but he'd endured far worse conditions in places where the temperature was the least of his concerns. Afghanistan in summer, where he'd spent months living in a hide site so small he couldn't fully extend his legs, waiting for a Taliban commander who might or might not appear. Iraq during the surge, when he'd operated from rooftops in Fallujah while insurgents hunted him with the same dedication he brought to hunting them. Those days seemed like a lifetime ago now, memories that felt like they belonged to someone else entirely. The Carlos Rodriguez, who had earned the call sign Ghost for his ability to appear and disappear without trace, bore little resemblance to the quiet food vendor who arrived at this gas station every morning at dawn and worked until sunset, sending money back to his elderly mother in Guadalajara and saving every penny he could spare. The transition from elite operative to civilian entrepreneur hadn't been easy. After 23 years of living in the shadows, conducting operations that would never appear in history books, Carlos had struggled to find his place in a world where people worried about mortgage payments instead of enemy sniper teams. The adrenaline that had once sustained him through impossible missions had been replaced by the quiet satisfaction of watching customers' faces light up when they tasted his grandmother's recipe for mole sauce. "Carlos, mi amigo," called out Big Jim Morrison, a long-haul trucker who stopped at Rodriguez's Corner Market at least twice a month. The massive man climbed down from his 18-wheeler, his weathered face breaking into a genuine smile. "Please tell me you've got some of those chicken tamales left. Been thinking about them since Oklahoma City." Carlos's own face softened into a smile that transformed his entire appearance. This was why he'd chosen this life, why he'd walked away from a career that had consumed his soul, one mission at a time. Simple human connections, honest work, the ability to bring a moment of joy to someone's day without anyone having to die for it. "Always save the best for my regular customers," Carlos replied in accented English, his voice carrying the warmth that came from genuine contentment. "Made them fresh this morning. Got the green salsa you like too." As he prepared Big Jim's order with practiced efficiency, Carlos allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. 5 years ago, when he'd first started this business with nothing but his military savings and his grandmother's recipes, he'd wondered if he could really build a life out of something so simple. Now he had regular customers who knew his name, who asked about his family, who treated him with the kind of respect he'd never received when he was eliminating high-value targets for his country. "You know what, Carlos?" Big Jim said as he accepted the steaming container of food. "You could probably make a fortune with these tamales if you opened a real restaurant. Ever think about expanding?" Carlos shrugged, the gesture carrying years of hard-won wisdom. "Some things are perfect just the way they are, amigo. Why fix what's not broken?" The trucker laughed and handed over a $20 bill for a $12 order, waving away Carlos's attempt to make change. "You keep the extra, hermano. Buy yourself something nice." As Big Jim drove away, Carlos felt the familiar warmth that came from honest appreciation for honest work. This was what peace felt like, he reflected. Not the absence of war, but the presence of something worth protecting. Something worth... The rumble of approaching motorcycles shattered the peaceful afternoon like a gunshot through glass. Carlos's entire body went still, every instinct honed by decades of combat operations suddenly screaming danger. The sound was wrong, not the organized formation of military vehicles or the casual noise of recreational riders, but the aggressive growl of predators announcing their presence. His head turned slightly, cataloging the audio signatures with the same precision he'd once used to identify enemy positions by sound alone. 4 bikes. Big engines, probably Harley-Davidsons or similar. Moving slowly, deliberately, like hunters who had found their prey and were taking time to position themselves for maximum effect. The riders were revving their engines unnecessarily, creating noise and intimidation rather than simply traveling from one place to another. Carlos's hands continued their routine work, arranging napkins and checking supplies, but his mind had already shifted into a different mode entirely. The peaceful food vendor was still there, still visible to any casual observer, but underneath that facade, Ghost was awakening after 5 years of dormancy. 23 years of special operations training doesn't simply disappear because a man decides he wants a quiet life. The threat assessment protocols, the tactical awareness, the ability to read hostile intent in body language and voice patterns, all of it remained intact, waiting just beneath the surface of consciousness, like a weapon that had been carefully cleaned and stored but never truly put away. The motorcycles turned into the gas station parking lot with theatrical slowness, their riders clearly more interested in making an impression than in actually purchasing fuel or food. Carlos didn't need to look directly at them to catalog every detail of their approach. Peripheral vision, enhanced by years of training, showed him 4 men in their 20s and 30s, wearing the kind of leather and denim combination that was meant to project menace. The leader was obvious, riding point, larger than the others, moving with the swaggering confidence of someone accustomed to intimidating civilians. The other 3 arranged themselves in supporting positions, a formation that spoke of experience in this kind of harassment even if they lacked any real tactical training. They were thugs, Carlos realized. Not gang members with serious criminal organization behind them, not drug dealers with real firepower and backup, just bullies who had found that motorcycles and aggressive behavior could give them power over people who couldn't or wouldn't fight back. Under normal circumstances, Carlos would have simply packed up his cart and left. 5 years of civilian life had taught him the value of avoiding trouble whenever possible. There was no shame in walking away from a fight, no dishonor in choosing peace over violence. He'd spent too many years dealing in death to have any romantic notions about the glory of combat. But these men had already made their first mistake. They'd chosen to bring their intimidation campaign to Rodriguez's corner market on a day when Carlos had nowhere to retreat. His truck was in the shop for repairs, leaving him dependent on his nephew Miguel to pick him up at closing time. The gas station owner, Sam Peterson, had been good to Carlos, letting him set up his cart here in exchange for a small percentage of his daily earnings and occasional free meals. Sam was inside the store now, probably already nervous about the biker's arrival. Carlos couldn't simply disappear without abandoning his livelihood and potentially exposing Sam to retaliation for hosting him. Sometimes, Ghost reflected with grim amusement, civilian life was more complicated than military operations. In the field, you always had an extraction plan. In real life, sometimes you had to stand your ground whether you wanted to or not. The lead rider brought his bike to a stop directly in front of Carlos's cart, close enough that the engine heat and exhaust fumes created a barrier between the food vendor and any potential customers. It was a classic intimidation tactic, designed to disrupt business while making a statement about who controlled the territory. The man who climbed off the motorcycle was exactly what Carlos had expected. 6 feet tall, heavily muscled from weight training rather than functional work, covered in tattoos that were meant to project an image of dangerousness rather than actual criminal affiliation. His black leather jacket bore patches that indicated membership in a club called the Road Demons, though Carlos noted that the patches lacked the sophisticated organization and territorial markers of serious outlaw motorcycle gangs. "Well, well, well," the leader said, his voice carrying the exaggerated drawl of someone trying to sound more intimidating than he actually was. "What do we have here? Looks like some wetbacks set up a taco stand on our territory." The racial slur hit Carlos like a physical blow, not because it hurt his feelings, but because it revealed exactly what kind of men he was dealing with. Professional criminals, even violent ones, rarely wasted time on racial harassment when they had business to conduct. These weren't professionals. They were something potentially more dangerous, amateurs with just enough power to be unpredictable. Carlos kept his expression neutral, his voice level and respectful. "Good afternoon, señores. Just trying to make an honest living. Got some excellent food if you're hungry." The response was calculated to project humble submission while gathering intelligence. How they reacted to his apparent compliance would tell him everything he needed to know about their intentions and their level of organization. "Honest living?" The leader laughed, a sound devoid of any genuine humor. "You got permits for this little operation, Paco? Health department clearance? Or are you just another illegal taking money away from real Americans?" Carlos had every permit required by state and local law, meticulously maintained and updated because he'd learned that legal compliance was the best defense against official harassment. But he sensed that these men weren't actually interested in the legitimacy of his business. They were looking for an excuse to escalate the confrontation, and providing them with legal documentation would probably just anger them further. "Just selling food to hungry people," Carlos replied calmly. "No trouble for anyone." The other three bikers had dismounted and were spreading out in a loose semicircle around his cart, a formation that would have been laughable to anyone with real tactical training, but which effectively prevented him from simply walking away. They moved with the casual confidence of predators who had done this before and never encountered serious resistance. "See, that's where you're wrong, amigo," the leader continued, stepping closer to Carlos's cart and deliberately knocking over a bottle of hot sauce with his elbow. The glass shattered on the asphalt, spreading red liquid across the pavement like blood. "This is our territory, has been for 2 years now, and in our territory people pay rent." There it was. Carlos felt a cold, familiar feeling settle into his stomach as the true nature of the situation became clear. These weren't random bullies looking for entertainment. They were running a protection racket, extorting money from small business owners who couldn't defend themselves. Sam Peterson probably paid them regularly to avoid exactly this kind of harassment. But Carlos's mobile cart represented an opportunity they couldn't resist. A vulnerable target with no obvious protection, probably carrying cash, operated by someone they assumed would be too frightened or too illegal to involve law enforcement. "How much rent?" Carlos asked quietly. The question seemed to surprise the leader, who had probably expected more protests or pleas for mercy. "Smart man, $100 a week, cash only, first payment due right now." Carlos did rapid mental calculations. $100 a week would wipe out more than half his profit margin, making it impossible to send money to his mother or save for the restaurant he hoped to open someday. But more importantly, giving in to extortion would mark him as a victim, ensuring that the demands would only increase over time. "That's a lot of money for a small business," Carlos said carefully. "Cost of doing business in the real world, amigo," the leader replied. "You can pay it willingly, or we can collect it along with damages to your little operation here, your choice." One of the other bikers, a wiry man with a snake tattoo covering most of his left arm, picked up one of Carlos's carefully arranged containers of salsa and deliberately dropped it. The plastic container split open, sending green sauce spreading across the asphalt to mix with the red from the broken bottle. "Oops," Snake Tattoo said with exaggerated innocence. "Clumsy me. Accidents happen when people don't pay attention to business arrangements." Carlos watched $5 worth of carefully prepared salsa spread across the dirty pavement and felt something cold and hard begin to crystallize in his chest. Not anger. Anger was a luxury he'd learned to set aside years ago. This was something else, something that came from a deeper place. For 5 years he'd built this business one customer at a time, one perfectly seasoned tamale at a time. He'd worked 16-hour days in blazing heat and freezing cold, learning to navigate health department regulations and tax codes, dealing with suppliers who thought they could cheat him because of his accent. Every dollar he'd earned represented hours of honest labor. Every regular customer represented a small victory against the prejudice and assumptions that followed him everywhere. These men wanted to take that away from him. Not just the money, but the dignity of honest work, the satisfaction of providing for himself and his family without having to hurt anyone. They wanted to reduce him to the status of victim, to make his hard-won peaceful life conditional on their approval and their greed. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Carlos said quietly. "Vul." The leader's face twisted into a sneer. "No misunderstanding, Paco. You pay, or you pack up and get out. Those are your only choices." "Actually," Carlos replied, his voice taking on a tone that hadn't been heard in this parking lot for 5 years, "there's a third option." Something in his voice made the lead biker hesitate for just a moment. Some primitive part of the man's brain was recognizing signals that his conscious mind couldn't process. The subtle shift in posture, the change in breathing pattern, the way Carlos's hands had moved from nervous fidgeting to perfect stillness. But the moment passed, and the biker's confidence returned. After all, what could one middle-aged Mexican food vendor do against 4 armed bikers? "Yeah," the leader said, stepping closer. "What third option is that, old man?" Carlos looked up at him, and for the first time since the bikers had arrived, made direct eye contact. What the lead biker saw in those dark eyes made him take an involuntary step backward, though he couldn't have explained why. "You could leave," Carlos said simply, "right now, before this becomes something you can't take back." The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from a gun that hadn't been fired yet. For a moment, the parking lot was absolutely silent, except for the distant hum of traffic and the gentle hiss of Carlos's steamer maintaining temperature. Then the leader laughed, but it was a different kind of laugh than before. This one had an edge of uncertainty to it, as if he was trying to convince himself, as much as his companions, that everything was still under his control. "Is that supposed to be a threat, wetback? You threatening us?" Carlos shook his head slowly. "No, senor, just offering some free advice. Sometimes the smart thing is to walk away from a situation you don't understand." Snake Tattoo chose that moment to grab one of Carlos's tamales, taking a large bite and then spitting it out with exaggerated disgust. "Tastes like shit, just like everything else you people make. No wonder you can't make an honest living." The racial insult was bad enough, but the deliberate waste of food that Carlos had woken up at 4 in the morning to prepare, using ingredients he'd carefully selected and seasoned according to his grandmother's recipe, struck a nerve that went deeper than mere economics. In the cultures that had shaped Carlos's childhood, food was sacred. You didn't waste it, you didn't mock it, and you certainly didn't spit it out in front of the person who had prepared it with care and pride. The gesture was designed to humiliate him, to reduce his life's work to garbage worthy only of contempt. That was when the ghost began to emerge. The change was subtle at first, invisible to anyone who hadn't spent years learning to read the signs of a professional killer switching from standby to active status. Carlos's breathing shifted from the slightly elevated pattern of a nervous civilian to the controlled rhythm of someone preparing for combat. His posture straightened almost imperceptibly, his weight shifting to the balls of his feet in a stance that would allow for maximum mobility and reaction speed. Most importantly, his eyes changed. The warmth that customers like Big Jim had come to associate with Carlos Rodriguez disappeared, replaced by something cold and calculating that belonged to Ghost. "You know," Carlos said conversationally, "I've been in this business for 5 years. Never had any real trouble before. Always wondered what I would do if someone tried to take advantage of me." The leader sensed that something had shifted in the dynamic, but he couldn't quite identify what had changed. Carlos still looked like the same middle-aged food vendor, still spoke in the same accented English, still stood behind the same modest cart selling tamales for $3 each. But some instinct was screaming at the biker that he needed to be very, very careful about what happened next. "Well, now you know," the leader said, though his voice lacked some of its earlier confidence. "You pay up or you pack up. Simple as that." "Simple," Carlos agreed, "but you're making some assumptions that might not be accurate." "Like what?" Carlos's smile was thin and cold, nothing like the warm expression his customers were used to seeing. "Like assuming I'm the kind of person who pays extortion money, like assuming I'm afraid of 4 thugs on motorcycles, like assuming you know who you're dealing with." The third biker, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up. He was younger than the others, maybe mid-20s, with the kind of nervous energy that suggested he was newer to this kind of criminal enterprise. "Come on, Mac," he said to the leader. "Maybe we should just leave the old guy alone. He's not bothering anybody." "Mac, apparently the leader's name, turned on his subordinate with the kind of vicious anger that bullies reserved for anyone who questioned their authority. "Shut your mouth, Tommy. Nobody asked for your opinion." But Tommy's suggestion had created a crack in the group's unity, a moment of uncertainty that Carlos filed away for potential use. Not all of them were equally committed to this confrontation. The young one, at least, might be willing to walk away if given the opportunity. "Smart kid," Carlos observed, "knows when to cut his losses." "Nobody's cutting anything," Max snarled, his face reddening with anger. "You got 5 seconds to decide whether you're paying voluntarily or whether we're taking it out of your hide." Carlos nodded thoughtfully, as if seriously considering the ultimatum. 5 seconds? That's not very long to make such an important decision. 1, Mac began counting. Carlos calmly reached into his cart and pulled out a clean towel, using it to wipe down his hands with meticulous care. 2. He folded the towel precisely and set it aside, then began removing his apron with the same methodical attention to detail he'd once brought to field-stripping weapons. 3. Carlos stepped out from behind his cart, moving with a fluid grace that seemed to contradict his apparent age and civilian occupation. 4. For the first time since the bikers had arrived, Carlos looked directly at each of them in turn. His gaze lingered on each face for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to memorize features, assess threat levels, and identify potential weak points. 5. De after levy 80er, but you can place the lieber have thatorid, fem je expect about a cold. "Time's up," Carlos said quietly. "While a rein kan treat fit wiskimo, time's up toffa laude, cordiewend, the plikes time guacht. Time's up tarmum or long nord, while are cumbled in mode, the plikes to glimp, time supplemer, lock of fat potato whites. Bo ben raider turpo perlites, ol be to pernandinken, and he make but an times up tarmo larby spoke by to chew point. Becca made her points a ball supple por ving of lowhood dome the plastrides. Times up tarmo log far eats pactin, the ruppel all the two, node and hub stanka with the bori. And its store would have tari nudwordy, and interred here we juids balt, but bout inspected so bout. The windpull andy two unden aramodes moglog fard. What happened next unfolded with the kind of brutal efficiency that comes only from decades of training and experience in situations where hesitation means death. Carlos moved like water flowing around obstacles, like smoke finding the path of least resistance. His first target was Snake Tattoo, who had made the mistake of standing too close while eating and spitting out the tamale. Carlos's left hand shot out with snake-like speed, fingers finding the precise pressure point below the man's ear that would render him unconscious without causing permanent damage. Snake Tattoo dropped like a marionette with cut strings, his body folding to the asphalt before his brain could process what had happened. The young biker, Tommy, started to reach for something under his jacket, but Carlos was already moving. A single step brought him within range, and his right elbow struck Tommy's solar plexus with exactly the amount of force necessary to temporarily paralyze his diaphragm. The young man doubled over, gasping for air that wouldn't come, temporarily removed from the fight, but not seriously injured. The third biker, older and more experienced than Tommy, but less aggressive than Snake Tattoo, had the presence of mind to back away and shout a warning. "Mac, this guy knows what he's doing." But Mac was already in motion, reaching for the pistol concealed beneath his leather jacket. He was fast for a civilian, Carlos noted with professional detachment. Fast enough to be dangerous if allowed to complete the draw. Carlos didn't allow it. 23 years of close-quarters combat training compressed into a single fluid movement. Carlos closed the distance between them before Mac could clear leather, his left hand clamping down on the biker's gun hand while his right delivered a precise strike to the median nerve cluster in Mac's neck. The pistol, a .38 revolver, Carlos noted automatically, fell to the asphalt with a metallic clatter that seemed incredibly loud in the sudden silence. Mac staggered backward, his right arm temporarily paralyzed from the nerve strike, confusion and fear replacing the arrogance that had carried him into this confrontation. "What the hell are you?" he gasped. The fourth biker, the one who had shouted the warning, was backing toward his motorcycle, clearly having decided that discretion was the better part of valor. Carlos let him go. One witness who could carry word about what had happened here might actually be useful. "I'm someone who just wants to sell tamales," Carlos replied calmly. "Someone who's been minding his own business for 5 years. Someone who really hoped he'd never have to do this kind of thing again." He walked over to where Snake Tattoo lay unconscious on the asphalt and knelt down to check his pulse. Steady and strong, the man would wake up in a few minutes with nothing worse than a headache and some serious questions about his life choices. Tommy was slowly recovering his ability to breathe, though he remained hunched over and gasping. No permanent damage there either, though it would be several minutes before he could stand upright. "You're military," Max said, his voice a mixture of awe and terror. "Special forces or something." Carlos stood up, dusting off his hands with the same methodical care he'd shown while cleaning them earlier. "Was? Retired now, or at least I was trying to be retired." He walked back to his cart and began assessing the damage. The broken bottles of salsa could be replaced, though it would take time to prepare new batches. The spilled tamale represented wasted ingredients and labor, but nothing that couldn't be recovered from. Overall, the financial damage was minimal. The psychological damage was another matter entirely. "You can't just attack people like that," Max said, cradling his paralyzed arm. "That's assault. I'll call the cops." Carlos's laugh was dry and humorless. "By all means, call them. Explain how you and your friends came here to extort money from a food vendor and got more than you bargained for. I'm sure they'll be very sympathetic." The suggestion seemed to remind Mac that his own position in this situation was far from defensible. Extortion was a felony in Texas, and explaining the circumstances that had led to his current predicament would require admitting to attempted criminal activity. Tommy had recovered enough to stand upright, though he was still breathing carefully and holding his midsection. "We should go," he said quietly. "We should go right now." "Smart kid," Carlos agreed, "always been a good judge of situations." The fourth biker, the one who had backed away, called out from beside his motorcycle. "Mac, we need to leave. This guy's some kind of professional." Snake Tattoo was beginning to stir, groaning softly as consciousness returned. Carlos knelt beside him again, this time to deliver a quiet but urgent message. "Listen carefully," he said, his voice pitched low enough that only Snake Tattoo could hear. "You and your friends are going to get on your motorcycles and leave. You're not coming back here, ever. You're not bothering this gas station again, ever. And you're going to spread the word that Rodriguez's corner market is off limits to anyone looking for easy money." Snake Tattoo's eyes focused with difficulty, trying to process both the message and the fact that he was lying on asphalt with no clear memory of how he'd gotten there. "If you don't follow those instructions," Carlos continued in the same quiet tone, "I'll start taking this personally. And trust me, amigo, you don't want me to take this personally." To emphasize his point, Carlos placed 2 fingers against the pressure point he'd used to render Snake Tattoo unconscious. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. He could put the man down again any time he chose, and next time he might not be so gentle about it. Snake Tattoo nodded frantically. Whatever bravado he'd possessed completely evaporated by his encounter with unconsciousness and the realization that he was dealing with someone far outside his league. Mac was helped to his feet by Tommy, who seemed eager to facilitate their departure. The feeling was gradually returning to the leader's arm, though his hand still shook slightly as he tried to flex his fingers. "This isn't over," Mac said, though his voice lacked any real conviction. "Yes, it is," Carlos replied with absolute certainty, "unless you want it to become something much worse than it already has been." The 4 bikers retreated to their motorcycles with considerably less swagger than they'd shown during their arrival. Snake Tattoo needed help mounting his bike, and Tommy kept glancing nervously over his shoulder as if he expected Carlos to change his mind about letting them leave. Only when their engines roared to life and they pulled out of the parking lot did Carlos allow himself to fully relax. The transformation back from Ghost to Carlos Rodriguez was visible in real time. The coiled tension leaving his muscles, the predatory alertness fading from his eyes, the familiar warmth returning to his expression. Sam Peterson emerged from the gas station, his face pale with shock. "Jesus Christ, Carlos, where did that come from?" Carlos was already cleaning up the spilled salsa, his movements returning to the methodical rhythm of a man focused on honest work. "Sometimes the past catches up with you, amigo. Sometimes you have to remind people that quiet doesn't mean weak." "But how did you—" I mean, those guys are part of the road demons. They've been running protection rackets all over the county. Nobody stands up to them." "Somebody just did," Carlos observed, disposing of the broken glass with careful attention to safety. "Hopefully they learned something from the experience." Sam shook his head in amazement. "Carlos, if there's anything you need, anything at all—" "Just what I've always needed," Carlos replied with a smile that was once again warm and genuine, "a place to set up my cart and customers who appreciate good food." But even as he spoke, Carlos knew that something fundamental had changed. Word of what had happened here would spread, as word always did in small communities. Some people would be inspired by the story of a quiet food vendor who had stood up to bullies. Others would be curious about his background, wondering what kind of training could produce such devastating results from such an unassuming source. And somewhere out there, the road demons would be having very serious conversations about whether they wanted to continue their protection racket business in a county where their victims might turn out to be retired special operations personnel. For better or worse, Ghost had emerged from 5 years of dormancy. The question now was whether Carlos Rodriguez could put him back to sleep, or whether the peaceful life he'd worked so hard to build was about to become considerably more complicated. The answer came 3 days later, when Big Jim Morrison pulled his 18-wheeler into the gas station and climbed down with an expression of profound relief. "Carlos, my friend," the trucker said, "I've been hearing some interesting stories about what happened here the other day." Carlos continued preparing Big Jim's usual order, his expression neutral. "Stories have a way of growing in the telling, amigo." "Maybe so," Big Jim agreed. "But I'll tell you what's not a story. For the first time in 2 years, I didn't have to pay the road demons their toll when I stopped at their usual spot on Highway 9. Seems they've decided to take a break from the protection business." Carlos handed over the container of tamales without comment, but he couldn't suppress a small smile of satisfaction. "Funny thing is," Big Jim continued, "word's spreading that there's someone in Cedar Ridge who doesn't tolerate bullies. Small business owners who've been paying protection money for years are starting to ask themselves why they need to keep doing it. People have a right to run their businesses without harassment," Carlos observed. "Damn right they do." Big Jim handed over his payment, plus the usual generous tip. "Keep doing what you're doing, Carlos, whatever that turns out to be." As the trucker drove away, Carlos reflected on the complexity of the situation he'd created. By standing up to the road demons, he'd struck a blow for every honest business owner in the county. But he'd also revealed capabilities that might attract the wrong kind of attention from people far more dangerous than small-town extortionists. 23 years of special operations work had taught him that violence, even justified violence, always carried consequences that extended far beyond the immediate situation. He'd opened a door that might be difficult to close again. But as he watched Sam Peterson arranging inventory in the gas station without the nervous glances over his shoulder that had been his constant companion for 2 years, Carlos decided that some doors needed to be opened, regardless of the consequences. Ghost might be awake again, but he was still in service to Carlos Rodriguez, and Carlos Rodriguez was going to continue selling the best tamales in East Texas, regardless of who might have a problem with that arrangement. The peace he'd found wasn't just about avoiding conflict. It was about protecting the things and people that mattered. Sometimes protection required nothing more than patience and hard work. Sometimes it required reminding bullies that their victims might not be as helpless as they appeared. Either way, Carlos was prepared to do whatever was necessary to preserve the life he'd built. 5 years of civilian experience had taught him the value of what he'd gained. 23 years of military experience had taught him how to keep it. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the horizon, Carlos Rodriguez continued his routine, serving excellent food to grateful customers and living proof that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who want nothing more than to be left alone. But word of the confrontation continued to spread, and with it came new challenges that would test whether Carlos could maintain his peaceful existence or whether Ghost would be forced to emerge again to protect what mattered most. The story of the food vendor who had defeated the road demons was already taking on legendary proportions in the bars and truck stops of East Texas. And legends, Carlos knew from hard experience, had a way of attracting both admirers and challengers. The quiet life he cherished was about to become considerably more complicated, whether he wanted it to or not. 3 weeks after the incident with the road demons, Carlos Rodriguez was beginning to think he might be able to return to the peaceful routine he'd worked so hard to establish. The harassment had stopped completely, not just at his location, but throughout the county. Other small business owners had quietly stopped paying protection money, and the road demons seemed to have moved their operations to more accommodating territory. But on a humid Thursday morning that promised to be brutally hot by afternoon, Carlos noticed something that made the fine hairs on the back of his neck stand up with familiar warning signals. A black sedan with tinted windows had been parked across the street from Rodriguez's corner market for the past 3 days. Different license plates each day, but the same make and model, the same positioning that provided clear sight lines to his cart while remaining far enough away to avoid casual observation. Professional surveillance. Carlos had spent enough years conducting such operations himself to recognize the signs immediately. The vehicle's occupants would be taking photographs, documenting his daily routine, identifying his regular customers, and recording their license plate numbers. They would know what time he arrived each morning, when he took breaks, how much money he typically handled, and whether he had any backup or security arrangements. The question was who they were and what they wanted. Federal law enforcement was the most likely possibility. Carlos's military service record was heavily classified, but not invisible to agencies with the proper clearance levels. If someone had connected Ghost to Carlos Rodriguez, they might be investigating whether he was involved in activities that went beyond selling tamales at a gas station. Another possibility was that his confrontation with the road demons had attracted attention from their suppliers or associates. Small-time protection rackets usually operated under the umbrella of larger criminal organizations that didn't appreciate having their revenue streams disrupted by unexpected variables. But there was a third possibility that made Carlos's blood run cold. Private contractors working for interests that had reasons to want Ghost permanently removed from the equation. 23 years of classified operations had left him with knowledge that certain people would pay substantial sums to ensure remained buried. Carlos continued his normal routine while conducting his own counter-surveillance, using reflective surfaces and peripheral vision to gather what information he could about his watchers. 2 people in the vehicle, probably male based on their silhouettes, definitely armed based on the way they position themselves. Professional bearing and discipline that suggested military or law enforcement backgrounds. On Friday morning, the black sedan was replaced by a white van with commercial markings, but the surveillance pattern remained the same. Carlos noted the change with grim appreciation for their thoroughness. Whoever was watching him had significant resources and professional expertise. That afternoon, Big Jim Morrison arrived for his regular stop and immediately sensed that something was wrong. "Carlos, mi amigo," the trucker said quietly, "you've got that look again, the same one you had right before you turned those bikers into pudding." Carlos glanced around carefully before responding. "Just staying alert, hermano. Sometimes the past has a longer reach than you'd like." Big Jim's expression grew serious. "Anything I can do to help? I may just be a trucker, but I've got friends in interesting places." The offer was generous and probably sincere, but Carlos couldn't afford to involve civilians in whatever was developing. "Appreciate it, but this is something I need to handle myself." That evening, as Carlos was packing up his cart for the day, a woman approached from the direction of the white van. She was tall, athletic, wearing business casual clothing that didn't quite conceal the fact that she was armed. Her approach was confident but non-threatening, hands visible, movements telegraphed well in advance. "Mr. Rodriguez," she said when she was still 10 feet away. "My name is Agent Sarah Chen, FBI. I'd like to speak with you if you have a few minutes." Carlos finished securing his equipment before responding. "About what, Agent Chen?" She reached slowly into her jacket and produced credentials that appeared genuine under Carlos's careful scrutiny. "About your military service record, and about some activities that have come to our attention recently." "I'm retired from military service," Carlos said carefully. "Have been for 5 years. Yes, we're aware of that. We're also aware of your encounter with the road demons 3 weeks ago. Quite impressive according to our sources." Carlos said nothing, waiting for her to reveal the real purpose of this conversation. Agent Chen seemed to appreciate his caution. "Mr. Rodriguez, we're not here to cause problems for you. Quite the opposite, actually. We have a situation that might benefit from your particular expertise." "I'm a food vendor," Carlos replied. "My expertise is in Mexican cuisine." "Your expertise," Agent Chen said with a slight smile, "is in solving problems that other people can't solve, problems that require a very specific skill set." The conversation was heading in a direction that Carlos had hoped to avoid permanently. "I'm not interested in government work anymore, Agent Chen. I like my life the way it is." "I understand that, and normally we wouldn't ask. But this situation involves a threat to national security that might require the kind of response that Ghost specialized in." The use of his old call sign made Carlos's jaw tighten slightly. "Ghost is retired." Perhaps, but Carlos Rodriguez just demonstrated that some skills don't retire, they just go dormant until circumstances require them. Agent Chen handed him a business card with nothing but a phone number written on it. "Think about it, Mr. Rodriguez. If you decide you're interested in hearing more, call that number. If not, we'll leave you to your tamales and your peaceful life." She turned to walk away, then paused. "One more thing. The road demons weren't just running independent protection rackets. They were part of a larger operation that's been funneling money to some very dangerous people. By shutting them down, you may have prevented something much worse than small-time extortion." With that, Agent Chen walked back to the white van and drove away, leaving Carlos alone with his thoughts and the business card that felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. As he waited for Miguel to pick him up, Carlos stared at the phone number and wondered whether 5 years of peace had been all he was going to get. The world he'd thought he'd left behind was calling him back, offering him a chance to use his skills for something that might actually matter. But it was also offering him a chance to lose everything he'd built, everything he'd worked so hard to become. Carlos Rodriguez, the food vendor versus Ghost, the operator. The quiet life versus the mission. By the time Miguel arrived, Carlos had made his decision. He crumpled up the business card and dropped it in a trash can, then climbed into his nephew's truck for the ride home. Some doors, once closed, should stay that way. But as they drove through the streets of Cedar Ridge, Carlos couldn't shake the feeling that the choice might not be entirely his to make. Some doors had a way of opening themselves, whether you wanted them to or not. And in the distance, barely visible in his side mirror, another black sedan was following them home. The next morning brought a problem that made Agent Chen's job offer seem almost appealing by comparison. Carlos arrived at his usual time to find Sam Peterson waiting for him in the gas station parking lot, his face grim with the kind of worry that comes from receiving threats you can't ignore. "Carlos," Sam said without preamble, "we've got a situation." The problem, as Sam explained it, was that shutting down the road demons' protection racket had created a power vacuum that other criminal organizations were eager to fill. Word had spread through the regional underworld that Cedar Ridge was open territory, ripe for new management by anyone with sufficient ambition and firepower. "3 different groups have contacted me in the past week," Sam continued. "All of them want to establish protection arrangements. All of them mentioned that they knew someone had taken out the road demons, and they want to make sure the same thing doesn't happen to them." Carlos listened with growing concern, as Sam described increasingly sophisticated criminal organizations showing interest in what had previously been small-town territory. These weren't amateur bikers running intimidation schemes. These were professionals with serious firepower and detailed intelligence about local operations. "They know about you, Carlos," Sam said quietly. "They know you're the one who took down Mac and his crew. Some of them see you as a threat to be eliminated. Others see you as a potential asset to be recruited or controlled." The situation was escalating beyond anything Carlos had anticipated when he decided to stand up to 4 extortionists. By demonstrating his capabilities, he'd attracted attention from elements that were far more dangerous than the road demons had ever been. "What kind of timeline are we looking at?" Carlos asked. "Days, not weeks. Maybe hours. Word is that the Sinaloa cartel is sending a delegation to assess the territory. If they decide Cedar Ridge is worth claiming, they'll move fast and hard to establish control." Carlos felt the familiar coldness settling into his chest as tactical considerations began overriding civilian concerns. Cartel involvement changed everything. These weren't thugs who could be discouraged with a demonstration of superior fighting skills. These were international criminals with extensive military training, unlimited financial resources, and a willingness to use extreme violence to achieve their objectives. Fighting them alone would be suicide. Running would mean abandoning everything he'd built and everyone who had supported him. Involving law enforcement would mark him as a target for retaliation that would never end. Carlos reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, then stopped. Agent Chen's business card was in a trash can behind the gas station, but he'd memorized the number before throwing it away. Some habits from his operational days died hard. For the first time in 5 years, Ghost was considering accepting a mission. But first, he needed to know exactly what he would be protecting and what resources he would have available. The peaceful life of Carlos Rodriguez might be ending, but it wouldn't end without a fight. And Carlos Rodriguez had learned a few things about fighting that might surprise even the Sinaloa cartel. The phone rang twice before Agent Chen answered. "I was wondering when you'd call," she said without preamble. "The situation has changed," Carlos replied. "We need to talk." "I'll be there in 30 minutes. As Carlos waited for the conversation that would determine the future of his carefully constructed peaceful life, he began making mental preparations for the possibility that Ghost might be coming out of retirement permanently. Some doors, once opened, changed everything that came after. Carlos was beginning to understand that he might have opened one of those doors 3 weeks ago when he decided that 4 bikers deserved a lesson in respect. Now he would discover whether that decision would save his community or destroy everything he'd worked to protect. The war for Cedar Ridge was about to begin, and Carlos Rodriguez was going to have to decide whether he was willing to become Ghost again to fight it. The answer would determine not just his own future, but the fate of everyone who had welcomed a quiet food vendor into their lives without knowing they were harboring one of the most dangerous men alive. Agent Chen arrived exactly 30 minutes later, this time in an unmarked government sedan that screamed federal law enforcement to anyone with eyes to see. She approached Carlos's cart with the same careful professionalism she'd shown before, but there was an urgency in her manner that suggested events were moving faster than anyone would have preferred. "Mr. Rodriguez," she said formally, though they were alone in the parking lot, "thank you for reconsidering." "Before we go any further," Carlos replied, "I need to know exactly what kind of situation we're dealing with. My community is about to be caught in the middle of something that could get a lot of innocent people killed." Agent Chen nodded approvingly. "Direct and to the point. I like that." She glanced around the empty parking lot, then continued. "What I'm about to tell you is classified at the highest levels, but given the circumstances, you need to know what you're dealing with." She opened a tablet and showed Carlos satellite images of the Mexican border region, focusing on areas he recognized from his operational days. 6 months ago, we identified a new smuggling network that's been moving something across the border that's considerably more dangerous than drugs or weapons. Carlos studied the images with professional interest. "What kind of something?" "Personnel. Foreign nationals with specialized training and very specific objectives. We've been tracking them for months, but they've been impossible to intercept because they don't follow any of the usual patterns." The implications were beginning to become clear. They're not coming through the normal border crossings. No, they're using a network of safe houses and transportation routes that appear to be completely separate from the established cartel infrastructure. But in the past 3 weeks, since your encounter with the road demons, we've detected increased activity in this region. Agent Chen showed him more images. These ones focused on Cedar Ridge and the surrounding area. "We believe your demonstration of capabilities has attracted attention from people who are very interested in recruiting or eliminating individuals with your skill set." Carlos felt the pieces of a much larger puzzle beginning to fall into place. "You think they're coming here specifically because of me. We think they were coming here anyway, and your presence represents either an opportunity or a threat they need to address. Either way, Cedar Ridge is about to become a very dangerous place." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sam Peterson, who approached with the nervous energy of someone who had been watching for trouble all morning. "Carlos," Sam said urgently, "there's a convoy of black SUVs heading this way. 3 vehicles, moving fast." Agent Chen was already reaching for her radio. "How far out?" "Maybe 5 minutes," Sam replied. "They've got government plates, but they don't look like any feds I've ever seen." Carlos made a decision that would change everything that followed. "Agent Chen, do you have backup available?" 2 minutes out, but they're not equipped for a serious firefight." "Then we'd better hope we don't need one." Carlos began securing his cart with quick, efficient movements. "Sam, get inside the station and lock the doors. Don't come out no matter what you hear." "What about you?" Sam asked. "Doesn't..." Carlos looked at Agent Chen, who nodded grimly. "We're about to find out whether Ghost is really ready to come out of retirement." The convoy of black SUVs arrived with theatrical precision, their occupants clearly more interested in making an impression than in conducting covert operations. 6 men emerged from the vehicles, all wearing expensive suits that didn't quite conceal the fact that they were heavily armed. Their leader was a tall, thin man with the kind of stillness that Carlos recognized from his own reflection during operational days. "Mr. Rodriguez," the man called out in accented English, "my name is Colonel Santos. I believe we have some business to discuss." Carlos stepped forward, positioning himself between the newcomers and Agent Chen. "What kind of business would that be, Colonel?" "The kind that involves your particular talents and our immediate needs. We have an operation that requires someone with your expertise." Agent Chen moved to Carlos's left, her hand resting casually near her concealed weapon. "Federal agents," she announced loudly. "You're all under arrest for conspiracy to commit terrorist acts." Colonel Santos laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Agent Chen, I believe, you've been watching us almost as carefully as we've been watching you." The situation was deteriorating rapidly into exactly the kind of confrontation Carlos had hoped to avoid. Too many armed professionals in too small a space, with innocent civilians nearby and unclear objectives on all sides. "Let's everybody take a step back and talk about this," Carlos suggested. "There's nothing to talk about," Colonel Santos replied. "You're coming with us, Mr. Rodriguez. The only question is whether you come voluntarily or whether we have to convince you." That was when the Ghost fully emerged. Carlos's transformation was visible to everyone present. The subtle shift in posture, the change in breathing, the way his eyes became cold and calculating. Agent Chen had read his file, but seeing the legend in person was a different experience entirely. "Colonel," Carlos said quietly, "you've made 2 mistakes. First, you assumed I would be intimidated by your little show of force. Second, you chose to threaten me in front of people I care about." "And what are you going to do about it?" Colonel Santos asked with professional curiosity. Carlos smiled, and Agent Chen found herself taking an involuntary step backward. This wasn't the warm expression that customers of Carlos Rodriguez had come to expect. This was something predatory and dangerous that belonged to Ghost. "I'm going to show you why I was called Ghost," Carlos replied, "and why some people should stay retired." What happened next would be analyzed by federal agencies for months afterward, becoming a case study in how a single individual with the proper training could neutralize multiple threats in confined spaces. But that analysis would come later. For now, the war for Cedar Ridge was about to begin in earnest, and Ghost was ready to remind everyone why legends become legends in the first place. The parking lot of Rodriguez's Corner Market was about to become a battlefield, and Carlos Rodriguez was about to demonstrate why 23 years of special operations training never truly retires. It just waits for the right moment to prove that some skills are permanent, and some people should never be underestimated. Colonel Santos was about to learn both of those lessons the hard way. The transformation was complete in less than 3 seconds. Carlos Rodriguez, the gentle tamale vendor who had become a beloved fixture at Rodriguez's Corner Market, disappeared entirely. In his place stood Ghost, 23 years of lethal training and battlefield experience condensed into a deceptively ordinary-looking man who had once been considered the most dangerous sniper in U.S. Special Operations. Colonel Santos recognized the change immediately. His own military background allowed him to read the subtle shifts in posture, breathing, and eye movement that marked the transition from civilian to operator. What he hadn't expected was the speed of the transformation, or the cold professionalism that now radiated from the man he'd assumed would be easy to intimidate or recruit. "Interesting," Colonel Santos murmured, his hand moving with practiced casualness toward his concealed weapon. "The reports didn't adequately convey your presence, Ghost." Agent Chen felt the atmosphere in the parking lot shift like the pressure drop before a violent storm. She'd read Carlos's classified files, studied his operation reports, and thought she understood what kind of man she was dealing with. But seeing Ghost in person was like watching a documentary about lions and then finding yourself face to face with an actual predator. "Colonel," Carlos said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to life-and-death decisions, "you have approximately 30 seconds to get back in your vehicles and leave. After that, this situation becomes irreversible." Santos smiled, but it was the expression of a professional killer rather than someone experiencing genuine amusement. "I'm afraid that's not possible, Ghost. You see, we've invested considerable time and resources in locating you. Walking away empty-handed isn't really an option." Behind Santos, his 5 subordinates had spread out in a loose semicircle, their movements coordinated but not quite disciplined enough to suggest elite military training. Carlos cataloged each man's position, weapon placement, and apparent skill level with the automatic precision of someone who had spent decades making such assessments under combat conditions. "Agent Chen," Carlos said without taking his eyes off Santos, "I'm going to need you to call for immediate backup and then take cover behind my cart." "Already done," Chen replied, her radio request for emergency support having gone out the moment she'd seen the black SUVs approaching. ETA 4 minutes. "That might be 3 minutes and 50 seconds too late," Carlos observed. Santos laughed again. "Your confidence is admirable, Ghost, but you're outnumbered 6 to 1. Even someone with your reputation has limitations." "Actually," Carlos replied conversationally, "I'm only outnumbered 6 to 2. Agent Chen is considerably more capable than you probably realize." Chen felt a brief surge of gratitude for the acknowledgement, followed immediately by terror at the implication that she was about to be involved in a gunfight with international criminals in a gas station parking lot in East Texas. "The question," Carlos continued, "is whether you're planning to take me alive or whether you've decided I'm too dangerous to recruit." Colonel Santos's expression grew more serious. "That depends entirely on your willingness to cooperate. We have a situation developing that requires your specific expertise. The financial compensation would be substantial, and the work would be familiar to you." "What kind of situation?" "The kind that involves high-value targets in defended positions. The kind that requires surgical precision from extreme distances. The kind that made you a legend in certain circles." Carlos felt a cold knot form in his stomach as the implications became clear. "You want me to kill someone." "We want you to eliminate a problem that conventional methods have been unable to address, someone who has become inconvenient to certain interests that prefer to remain anonymous." "And if I refuse?" Santos shrugged with elaborate casualness. "Then you become inconvenient as well, along with anyone who might have developed an attachment to your current peaceful existence." The threat to his community was exactly what Carlos had been afraid of. By revealing his capabilities 3 weeks ago, he'd opened a door that led directly to this moment, a choice between returning to a life he'd thought he'd left behind forever or watching innocent people suffer for his decision to stand up to bullies. "Who's the target?" Carlos asked. Agent Chen shot him a sharp look, wondering if he was seriously considering accepting an assassination contract from international criminals. But Carlos's expression remained carefully neutral, revealing nothing about his intentions. "A federal judge who has been causing difficulties for certain import-export operations," Santos replied. "Judge Patricia Morrison. She's been unusually thorough in her review of cases involving our business associates." The name hit Carlos like a physical blow. Judge Patricia Morrison was Big Jim Morrison's younger sister, the federal magistrate who had built a reputation for refusing to be bought, intimidated, or influenced by anyone. She was also one of the few people in the legal system who had consistently ruled against the kind of criminal enterprises that Santos represented. "I know Judge Morrison," Carlos said quietly. "She's a good person." "She's an obstacle," Santos corrected, "one that needs to be removed with sufficient plausible deniability to avoid attracting unwanted attention." Carlos nodded thoughtfully, as if seriously considering the proposition. "What's the timeline?" 48 hours. The compensation is $2 million, half paid in advance." "That's a generous offer," Carlos acknowledged, "but I'm afraid I'm going to have to decline." Santos's face hardened. "I was hoping you would be reasonable about this." "I am being reasonable," Carlos replied. "I'm reasonably certain that anyone who threatens my community or tries to force me to murder a federal judge is someone I need to eliminate as quickly as possible." The parking lot erupted into chaos with the kind of sudden violence that separates professionals from amateurs. But what happened next would have surprised even Carlos's former commanding officers, who thought they knew the full extent of Ghost's capabilities. Carlos moved like liquid lightning, his first target being the gunman positioned closest to Sam Peterson's gas station. The man went down to a precise strike to the carotid artery before he could clear leather, dropping unconscious to the asphalt without firing a shot. Agent Chen, following Carlos's earlier suggestion, had taken cover behind the tamale cart while simultaneously drawing her service weapon. Her first shot took out the gunman who had been moving to flank Carlos's position, the bullet striking his shoulder and spinning him around before he could bring his weapon to bear. Santos himself proved to be faster and more experienced than his subordinates. His pistol, a high-end Sig Sauer P226, cleared its holster with professional speed, but Carlos was already moving. 23 years of close-quarters combat training compressed into a single fluid motion that closed the distance between them before Santos could acquire a proper sight picture. The colonel was good, fast enough to partially deflect Carlos's initial strike and skilled enough to attempt a counterattack that might have worked against a normal opponent. But Ghost had spent years fighting people who were trying very hard to kill him, and muscle memory took over with devastating efficiency. Santos's gun hand was trapped and twisted with precisely applied leverage that forced him to drop his weapon. A follow-up strike to his solar plexus doubled him over, and a carefully controlled blow to the base of his skull rendered him unconscious without causing permanent damage. The entire engagement lasted less than 20 seconds. Agent Chen emerged from behind the tamale cart to find 4 men unconscious on the asphalt, one wounded but conscious gunman being efficiently zip-tied by Carlos, and Colonel Santos lying motionless beside his dropped weapon. "Jesus Christ," she breathed. "I've read your files, but seeing it in person." Carlos was already moving among the fallen men, checking pulses and ensuring that none of them posed a continuing threat. "Are they all alive?" Chen asked. "All breathing, all going to wake up with headaches and some serious questions about their career choices," Carlos confirmed, "though the one you shot is going to need medical attention for that shoulder wound." The sound of approaching sirens announced the arrival of Chen's backup, 3 FBI vehicles and 2 county sheriff's cruisers, their occupants emerging with the kind of tactical alertness that suggested they'd been briefed on the potential for serious trouble. "Agent Chen," called out the lead FBI agent, a tall man with graying hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. "Status report." "Situation contained," Chen replied. 6 suspects in custody, 1 requiring medical attention, no civilian casualties. The senior agent, his badge identified him as Special Agent in Charge Williams, surveyed the scene with professional appreciation. "All 6? By yourselves?" Chen glanced at Carlos, who was now calmly cleaning his hands with a sanitizing wipe while examining his tamale cart for damage. "Mr. Rodriguez provided assistance." Williams looked at Carlos with new interest. "Mr. Rodriguez, we've heard some interesting things about you." "I just wanted to sell tamales," Carlos replied mildly. "But sometimes people make that more complicated than it needs to be." Over the next 3 hours, the parking lot of Rodriguez's corner market became the center of a federal investigation that would eventually span 3 countries and expose a human trafficking network that had been operating for more than 2 years. Colonel Santos, once he regained consciousness, proved surprisingly willing to cooperate with federal authorities in exchange for protection from the criminal organizations he'd been working with. The story he told was even more disturbing than Agent Chen had initially suspected. The network wasn't just smuggling foreign operatives into the United States. They were recruiting former military personnel with specialized skills for assassination contracts that would have been impossible to trace back to their true sponsors. "Carlos Rodriguez was supposed to be our crown jewel," Santos explained during his initial interrogation. "A legendary sniper with no official existence, no traceable background, perfect deniability for the kind of work our clients require." Agent Williams leaned forward across the interview table. "What made you think he would be willing to work for you?" "Everyone has a price," Santos replied. "And everyone has pressure points. We were prepared to offer him more money than he could make in 10 lifetimes of selling food, and if that didn't work, we had other methods of persuasion." "Such as?" "Threats to his community, his customers, the people he's grown attached to. We had intelligence suggesting that he cared more about protecting others than protecting himself. Williams exchanged glances with Agent Chen, who was observing the interview through one-way glass. Santos's assessment of Carlos's motivations had been accurate, but he'd completely misjudged how those motivations would translate into action. "Did you really think you could force someone with his training to commit murder?" Williams asked. Santos shrugged. "It's been done before. Isolation, pressure, removal of alternatives. There are ways to make anyone cooperate if you're willing to be patient and thorough." "But you weren't patient," Chen observed, speaking through the intercom. "You rushed the approach. We had intelligence that other organizations were also becoming aware of his presence. If we didn't move quickly, we risked losing the opportunity entirely." Meanwhile, in another part of the federal building, Carlos was providing his own account of events to a different team of investigators. His perspective on the confrontation was clinical and precise, delivered in the kind of detailed tactical language that left no doubt about his professional background. "Colonel Santos made several critical errors," Carlos explained to Agent Martinez, who had been assigned to debrief him. "First, he assumed that isolation and threats would be sufficient to control my response. Second, he underestimated Agent Chen's capabilities. Third, he failed to properly assess the tactical environment before committing to a confrontation." "What do you mean by tactical environment?" Carlos smiled slightly. "A gas station parking lot in broad daylight, with civilian witnesses and federal agents present, is not an ideal location for kidnapping or coercion. It suggests either desperation or extremely poor planning." Agent Martinez consulted her notes. "According to Colonel Santos, they had been tracking you for several weeks. Why do you think they chose that particular moment to approach you?" "Because they knew about the Sinaloa cartel's interest in the territory," Carlos replied. "They were racing against time to recruit me before someone else eliminated me as a potential threat." The revelation about cartel involvement added another layer of complexity to an already complicated situation. Federal agencies had been tracking increased cartel activity in East Texas for months, but they hadn't connected it to the recruitment of former Special Operations personnel. "Mr. Rodriguez," Agent Martinez said carefully, "we're going to need your help to fully unravel this network." Carlos leaned back in his chair, considering the implications. "What kind of help?" "The kind that might require you to become Ghost again, at least temporarily." The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. Agent Williams entered, his expression grim. "Mr. Rodriguez, we've got a problem. Word of what happened today has already reached certain criminal organizations. We're picking up chatter that suggests you've become a high-priority target." Carlos wasn't surprised. "How high priority?" "The kind where they're willing to offer seven-figure bounties to anyone who can eliminate you." The news was troubling, but not unexpected. By publicly demonstrating his capabilities and then cooperating with federal law enforcement, Carlos had marked himself as a significant threat to criminal enterprises throughout the region. "What are my options?" he asked. Williams sat down across from him. "Witness protection is the safest choice. New identity, relocation, complete separation from your current life. And the other options? You help us take down the entire network. We use your reputation and their interest in eliminating you to draw them into situations where we can arrest or neutralize them." Carlos was quiet for a long moment, thinking about Sam Peterson, Big Jim Morrison, and all the other people who had welcomed him into their community without knowing anything about his background. Witness protection would keep him safe, but it would mean abandoning them to whatever retaliation might follow his disappearance. "If I help you," Carlos said finally, "what kind of timeline are we looking at?" 6 months, maybe a year, long enough to identify and dismantle the major players in the network. "And afterward?" Williams smiled. "Afterward, you go back to selling tamales. We'll make sure of it." That evening, Carlos returned to his small apartment in Cedar Ridge to find Agent Chen waiting for him on his front porch. She stood up as his nephew Miguel dropped him off, her expression serious but not hostile. "Agent Chen," Carlos said, "I wasn't expecting to see you again so soon." "We need to talk," she replied, "about what happens next." Carlos unlocked his front door and gestured for her to enter. His apartment was modest but comfortable, decorated with photographs of family members and certificates from his food vendors' licenses. It was the home of a man who had worked hard to build a quiet, honest life. "Coffee?" Carlos offered. "Please." As he prepared coffee with the same methodical attention to detail he brought to everything else, Carlos waited for Chen to explain her visit. "The investigation is moving faster than we expected," she said finally. "Santos's cooperation has opened up leads we didn't know existed, but it's also attracted attention from people who would prefer to keep their activities hidden." Carlos handed her a cup of coffee and sat down across from her. "What kind of attention?" "The kind that involves professional killers being hired to eliminate potential witnesses. You, specifically." The news was concerning, but not surprising. How professional? Professional enough to worry us. International contractors with military backgrounds and significant resources. Carlos sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "Any particular timeline?" "Soon. Maybe days, maybe hours, which is why we need to make a decision about how to proceed." "Agent Chen," Carlos said quietly, "I need you to understand something. 5 years ago, I walked away from a life where people trying to kill me was a daily reality. I've been very happy not having to worry about whether every stranger I meet might be carrying a weapon intended for me. I understand that. But the situation has changed. Whether you help us or not, you're now a target. The only question is whether you're a target with backup or a target standing alone." Carlos looked around his apartment, taking in the simple furnishings and family photographs that represented everything he'd built since leaving the military. The peaceful life he'd worked so hard to create was slipping away, but perhaps it had always been an illusion. "What exactly are you proposing?" he asked. But Chen leaned forward. "We want to set up a safe house operation, use your presence as bait to draw out the criminal network while providing you with sufficient protection and support to survive the process." "And my community? My business?" "We'll provide security for the gas station and your regular customers. This isn't just about protecting you, it's about protecting everyone who might become collateral damage." Carlos was quiet for several minutes, weighing options that all seemed to lead away from the quiet life he'd hoped to maintain permanently. "How long would this operation last?" he asked finally. "Until we've identified and neutralized the major threats to your safety and the safety of your community." "And if I refuse?" Chen's expression grew grim. "Then you'll be facing those threats alone, with no support and no resources except what you can provide for yourself." Carlos stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the small town that had become his home. Cedar Ridge wasn't much, a few thousand people, mostly honest working folks trying to make decent livings and raise their families in peace. But it was his home now, and these were his people. "Agent Chen," he said without turning around, "if I agree to this, I need guarantees." "What kind of guarantees?" "That when this is over, I get my life back. My business, my community, my peaceful existence. No more federal agencies showing up with job offers. No more criminals trying to recruit or eliminate me. Just Carlos Rodriguez selling tamales and sending money to his mother." "You have my word," Chen replied, "and the word of the federal government." Carlos laughed, but there was no humor in it. The word of the federal government. That's not exactly the gold standard of reliability. "Maybe not, but it's the best guarantee you're going to get under the circumstances." Carlos turned back to face her. What would this operation look like? Chen opened a tablet and showed him preliminary plans. "We establish a security perimeter around Rodriguez's corner market. You maintain your normal routine, but with federal protection and surveillance. When the criminal network makes their move, we're ready for them. And if they're smart enough to wait us out, we make them think they have opportunities they don't actually have. Create situations that look vulnerable but are actually carefully controlled traps." Carlos studied the plans with professional interest. The tactical setup was sophisticated and well thought out, with multiple layers of protection and clear escape routes if things went wrong. How many agents would be involved? 24 initially, with more available if needed. This would be a significant operation with substantial resources. And the risks to civilians? Minimized through careful planning and overwhelming force advantage. We don't want a war in your parking lot any more than you do. Carlos made his decision. "All right, Agent Chen, but I have conditions." "Name them." First, my nephew Miguel is brought into the security perimeter. He picks me up every evening, and I won't have him driving into a potential ambush. Agreed. But second, Sam Peterson and his family get protection. He's been good to me, and I won't let him suffer for it. Also agreed. Third, if this operation goes badly and innocent people are endangered, I reserve the right to end my cooperation and handle the situation my own way. Chen hesitated. That's more difficult to agree to. Agent Chen, Carlos said quietly, you've seen what I can do when I choose to act. Would you rather have me working with you or against you? With you, she admitted. Definitely with you. Then those are my conditions. Chen stood up and extended her hand. Welcome back to the war, Ghost. Carlos shook her hand, feeling the weight of a decision that would change everything that followed. Let's hope it's a short war. The next morning brought the beginning of the most complex federal operation ever conducted in Cedar Ridge, Texas. By dawn, Agent Chen's team had established a security perimeter around Rodriguez's corner market that was invisible to casual observation, but would have impressed professional military planners with its thoroughness and sophistication. Carlos arrived at his usual time to find everything appearing completely normal. Sam Peterson was opening the gas station, early morning customers were stopping for coffee and fuel, and his tamale cart was exactly where he'd left it the day before. Only someone with extensive training would have noticed the subtle signs that 20 federal agents were positioned throughout the area. Morning, Carlos, Sam called out with forced cheerfulness. How's business looking today? Same as always, Carlos replied, beginning his routine setup. Good food for good people. But as he arranged his supplies and checked the temperature of his steamer, Carlos found himself automatically cataloging potential threats and escape routes with the kind of tactical awareness he'd thought he'd left behind forever. Ghost was awake again, and this time he wasn't going back to sleep until the job was finished. The war for Cedar Ridge was about to begin in earnest, and Carlos Rodriguez was ready to fight it on his own terms, with his own methods, and with the full support of the federal government behind him. But he was also acutely aware that the enemy they faced was professional, well-funded, and extremely dangerous. The peaceful life he'd built was now officially on hold, perhaps permanently. Some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. Carlos was beginning to understand that his encounter with the road demons 3 weeks ago had been the first step in a journey that would either restore his peaceful existence or destroy it entirely. Either way, Ghost was ready for whatever came next.